I have made a ton of videos on the original Xbox, and one of the things that I always talk about that makes the system so great is not only the ability to play, obviously, the great games that came out in that original Xbox generation, that era, because I believe the better versions of any multi-platform game is going to be on the original Xbox, but I've always emphasized the fact that there's great emulation on the system. I mean, there are consoles you can emulate that I didn't even know existed. Very obscure things can be emulated on the original Xbox. But then, of course, there's those main consoles that I'm really interested in, like the Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, all the iterations of the Game Boys, the different Sega consoles, all the way up until not including the Saturn, can be emulated on the original Xbox. And I think it's absolutely fantastic. Now, I never mentioned that you can emulate the original PlayStation because you technically can, it just performs very poorly. And people have noticed that when I mentioned the Nintendo 64, that as well performs rather poorly on the original Xbox, and that's because people oftentimes are not using optimized ROMs. So there's a set of ROMs put out by someone named Earthworm Jame that are basically optimized to be played on the original Xbox. There's 212 Nintendo 64 games in this pack, which the pack has became kind of difficult to find. I found it originally on the ISO zone, and since the ISO zone disappeared about a year ago, or the site didn't disappear, but they took all the download links off of it, so it's relatively useless now. It's became very hard to find 212 game pack. Now, there is one video on YouTube by Retro Pro Frank that has a link to a mega page that has the download on. So I'm going to have Retro Pro Frank's video linked down in the description. You can find it through the description of his video, the download link. I think it's his upload, so I don't want to take his link and use it as my own, so you can find it through his video. But I'm showing here on the screen some gameplay that came from my original Xbox. Now, it's important to note that this is emulation. Would you get a better experience off of an original Nintendo 64 or a re-released Nintendo 64, something like what Hyperkin is going to be putting out soon, which can play original Nintendo 64 cartridges, but it's an HDMI-based console? Yes, because this is emulation and it's not going to be perfect. For one reason or another, it has something to do with cartridges and the RAM and something more sophisticated than I want to get into. It's very difficult to emulate the Nintendo 64 correctly on certain games. So you see here some of the games I've shown, Super Mario Kart, the Pokemon Stadium 2, and then I'm also going to show GoldenEye. Those are some of the more difficult games to emulate, and I think that the Xbox does it at a fair quality. You can definitely see in Pokemon Stadium that there is some serious glitches on the main menu, and that's pretty much on any emulator I've ever used. I've seen those glitches on the main menu, but outside of that, the battles play well. You can tell that there's some icons missing during the battles, like the trainer pictures, and at the end of the battle, you'll see that the Pokemon icons are missing. So different small things like that are going to be missing when you're doing emulation like this. But I think that if you haven't experienced, many of these 212 games, I think that this is a fantastic way to play them. And I will note that there are complaints oftentimes with people playing Nintendo 64 games in this century who maybe didn't initially play them back in the day, that the control scheme is a little bit outdated, especially if you're not using your typical Nintendo 64 controller. So obviously I'm playing this with an original Xbox controller, and especially for the first-person shooter games like GoldenEye, Earthworm Jim has actually optimized the controls to a preset layout that feels more like a modern shooter, and I think that is absolutely fantastic, and those are set in there by default. Now, I also want to mention that there are save states in this, so you don't necessarily have to use the in-game saving. You can use the save states. I think that's super convenient, and you're able to just pull up that overlaid menu by pushing in the two joysticks simultaneously. And you can see when I push in the two joysticks simultaneously on GoldenEye that the menu has a different resolution than it did in something like Pokemon Stadium. That's because, again, all of these ROMs are optimized to run in a certain way. They have, preset settings that he has found to be the best to use for the game, and they're using those settings to make the game run as smoothly as possible as it can on an original Xbox. And of course, if you're like, how the heck do I get this on my original Xbox, you can soft mod the console and FTP it over that way, which soft modding an original Xbox is something you can find a guide pretty easily for if you just look for one on YouTube. I think there's just a bunch of fantastic guides out there. I'd be hard pressed to even recommend one in particular. So let me know what you guys thought of the Nintendo 64 running on an original Xbox. I think that's very playable. I don't think that it's perfect, but I think that if it's something that you're interested in trying, it's definitely worth your time. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.